She set a crate down wrong and split the corner seam, and that was when Kale noticed her. Most travelers at the Vareth crossing didn't bother picking up what spilled. They kicked it aside, flagged someone down, or simply walked off. This one crouched immediately, gathered the small wrapped parcels back into the cracked crate with careful hands, and said nothing to anyone. She was silver-skinned in the way of the Savari, long jaw, high cheekbones, eyes the pale gold of old coin, dressed in a plain traveler's coat, hood still up in the morning heat. Her clothes were wrong. Not dirty wrong or cheap wrong. Wrong in a way Kale couldn't have explained if pressed. Too muted, like someone had gone out of their way to find the most ordinary thing possible. He walked over and crouched across from her. "The seam's gone," he said. "I've got cord in the stall, takes 30 seconds. She looked at him with those coin-colored eyes. Not gratitude and not suspicion. Something more careful than either. "I can manage," she said. "I know you can. Offer stands." He went back to his stall and found the cord anyway, set it on the edge of the table where she could see it. She watched him for a moment, then picked it up without comment and lashed the crate together herself. When she was done, she set the cord back where she'd found it and moved on into the crossing. That was the first morning. The Vareth crossing was the largest trade outpost on the rim's eastern edge. 2 kilometers of covered stalls, repair bays, and fuel depots sprawling between the old ore processing towers. Kale ran a small fabrication booth near the southern end. Parts, fittings, custom work. He'd been at the crossing for 4 years. He knew most of the regulars and could read most travelers inside a few minutes. The Savari woman was a traveler, clearly, but she came back the second morning and stood at the edge of the stall's awning, looking at the parts laid out on the rack without touching anything. "Pressure fitting?" he asked, not looking up from the actuator he was calibrating. "The inlet collar on a secondary coolant loop. 3rd generation Heron configuration, if that means anything." It meant something. 3rd gen Heron was old, discontinued, the parts hard to come by. He looked up. "I've got 2 in the back. Which size?" She told him. He found the collar, brought it out, and named a price that was fair, not inflated for an obvious stranger, not lowered out of pity. She paid it without negotiating. That was unusual. Most people either pushed back or accepted too quickly because they didn't know what it was worth. She paid the exact amount without hesitation, which meant she knew exactly what a 3rd gen Heron inlet collar cost at current market rates. "You're a mechanic," he said. "Among other things." She left. He watched her go. Something about the way she walked bothered him. Not the walk itself, but the effort behind it. The way someone walks when they're practicing looking unhurried. She came back the 3rd morning. This time she bought nothing. She sat on the low platform across from his stall where travelers sometimes rested their feet, and she had a cup of something hot and watched the crossing traffic. He let her sit. When the mid-morning rush thinned out, she spoke without looking at him. "You didn't raise your price yesterday." "No. I'm not from here, you knew that." "I knew that. Most vendors add between 12 and 30% for unfamiliar faces." She turned the cup in her hands. "You didn't. I charged you what it was worth." Kale fit a housing plate to the piece he was working on and checked the alignment. Adding 30% for strangers is adding a charge for being a stranger. Doesn't seem right. A pause. "That's a strange principle for a marketplace." "It's the only one I've got." She was quiet for a while. The traffic moved. A Kethani trader 3 stalls down was arguing about delivery terms at volume. Somewhere in the middle distance, a loader was dropping crates in rhythm, 4 beats and a pause. Kale worked. She drank whatever she was drinking and watched the space between the stalls the way someone watches a fire, not seeing it, just keeping it in focus. "What do you call this place?" she asked. "The Crossing. Some people call it Vareth. The charter name is Port Vareth Rimside Station, but nobody uses that except the administration and people filing complaints." "Do you like it here?" He considered the question the way it deserved. "Most days." It's honest. Things need fixing and people need parts and nobody's lying about what they want. She looked at him then, and this time the care behind her eyes was different. Not the calculation of the first day, but something quieter, more deliberate, as though she was looking at something she hadn't expected to find. "The inlet collar worked," she said, "for what it's worth." "Good to hear." She stood, straightened her coat, and walked back into the crossing. He watched the gap she left in the crowd for a second longer than necessary. She appeared again on the fourth day, which he hadn't expected. She sat in the same spot. He worked. At some point she said, "You don't ask who people are." "Not my business, unless they make it my business." "Doesn't that make it harder to know who you're dealing with?" "Sometimes." He finished the cut he was making and set the piece down. "But I'd rather deal honestly with someone I don't know than badly with someone I do." He glanced across. "I figure most people here are what they look like. Travelers, traders, people who need a thing fixed. Anything beyond that is their story to tell." She said nothing. He went back to work. An hour later he heard the argument from 2 stalls up, not unusual at the crossing, but the voice on one side was one he recognized. He looked over the edge of his awning. Vena was standing at the tool stall with a power cell in her hand, and the vendor across from her was citing a price that was 60% higher than the posted rate on the board behind him. She hadn't moved, hadn't raised her voice. She was simply holding the cell and looking at the number on the board, and then at the vendor with that same coin-colored patience. Cale walked over. "Harvin," he said, "what's the board rate?" The vendor, older man, perpetual squint, 6 years at the crossing, looked between Cale and the woman. "Rate changes with demand." "The board hasn't changed since this morning. I can see it from here." Another pause. Harvin muttered something about installation fees and put the correct number into the exchange terminal. Vena paid it, took the cell, and walked back. She didn't say anything until she'd sat back down on the platform. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "He does it to travelers," Cale said. "I've said something before, he forgets." He picked up the cut piece. "It's not about you specifically." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it interesting." He didn't know what to make of that, so he didn't try. He kept working. She stayed until the afternoon stalls began to close, and then she left the way she always left, quietly, at her own pace, with nothing owed in either direction. Later that same afternoon, he'd thought she was gone. She came back one more time with something wrapped in paper. She set it on the edge of the work table without comment. A packet of ground kelsa root from the crossing's eastern food stalls, the kind that brewed into something bitter and warm. He'd mentioned, somewhere in the third morning conversation, that the local coffee substitute was barely worth the credits it cost. He looked at the packet. He looked at the empty platform. She was already halfway back into the crowd. He put the packet in his jacket pocket and kept working. When she didn't appear on the morning of the 5th day, he noticed the absence. Not with alarm, just with the flat acknowledgement of a thing that had become part of the day's texture and was now missing. He found himself glancing at the platform twice, before the first customer of the morning arrived with a stripped torque coupling and a deadline. He was midway through the coupling repair when the sound changed. He heard it before he saw it, a low, synchronized hum from the direction of the eastern gate. The crossing traffic slowed and then parted, the way water parts around a dropped stone. 4 figures came through the gap, tall, armored in the dark silver of the Savari Imperial Guard, faces obscured behind visor plates, and behind them 4 more. 8 guards cutting a corridor through the marketplace, and at its end, where Cale stood watching with a part still in his hand, the woman in the traveler's coat. She had stopped in the open space between the stalls. The guard stopped with her. The crossing went quiet in the way of places that have suddenly understood a situation all at once. Every Savari trader, every person who dealt with the Empire long enough to recognize what 8 Imperial guards walking in formation meant, they were already lowering their heads. Kale saw it happen in a slow wave. Hoods dipping, hands lowering, bodies folding into the respectful half-bow that the Empire expected from civilians in the presence of its nobility. The Kethani trader 3 stalls down, who had been arguing with someone about delivery terms half a minute ago, was bent at the waist before Kale had processed what he was seeing. Kale looked at the woman. She was looking at him. He realized in the next second that he was the only person in his line of sight still standing straight, not out of defiance. He simply hadn't moved yet. He'd been watching her face, and the face said, "Don't look away." One of the guards spoke in a low, formal register. "The Empressaire of Sova, Vena of the first line, thanks the outpost for its hospitality and takes her leave." The title landed on Kale like a slow wave of cold. Empressaire. He'd been selling her pressure fittings and correcting his neighbor's price board and letting her sit on a platform for 5 days, and she was the Empressaire of Sova. He worked that over in his mind and found it didn't change any of the conversations they'd had, which was perhaps the strangest discovery of the morning. Vena stepped past the guard who had spoken and walked to where Kale stood at the edge of his stall. Up close, not performing anything, she was exactly what she had been for 5 days, composed, careful, coin-colored eyes missing nothing. She reached into her coat and placed something on his work table, a small disc of dark metal, stamped with the Savari imperial glyph, the kind given to merchants who had received an imperial commendation. "In case you ever cross into Empire space," she said, "it carries weight at any Savari port." "I didn't do anything special," he said, because it was true. "That," she said, "is precisely why." She held his gaze for a moment, not a performance, not for the crossing or the guards or the boat heads all around them, for him. "You charged me what things were worth," she said. "You let me sit. You didn't ask who I was or try to give me less than I paid for or more than I asked for. You treated me like a person in the ordinary middle of a day." Her voice was even. "I have been preparing for the throne of Sova for 11 years. I have been assessed by advisors and generals and high priests and trade ministers and 3 separate war councils. Not one of them ever did what you did." "What did I do?" "Nothing." She tilted her head slightly, not quite a bow, but the movement a person makes when they mean one. "That was the test." She set a folded document beside the disc. "The Empressaire also names a formal friend of the court, no ceremony, no obligation, but your name will be heard anywhere in Empire space." She paused. "I don't give it often." "I still didn't do anything," he said. "No," she said, "and in 11 years of testing, I have never found a harder thing to teach." She turned and walked back to her guards. The corridor they'd made through the crossing began to close again as she moved into it. Kale stood at the edge of his stall with nothing in his hands and watched the last of the silver armor disappear through the eastern gate. Around him, the crossing was coming back to life, voices resuming, traders straightening, the loader somewhere in the middle distance starting its 4-beat rhythm again. The Kethani trader 3 stalls down already had his hands going. Harvin, at the tool stall, was very carefully not looking in Kale's direction. He set the coupling down on the work table beside the disc and the document, and the cord he kept near the edge for when travelers needed it. He stood for a long moment, looking at the eastern gate. 11 years preparing for a throne, advisors and generals and high priests and war councils. He thought about what it meant to spend 11 years in rooms where everyone knows exactly who you are, where everything you say is weighed against your rank, and everything they say back is adjusted for it, where no one ever just hands you a cord and gets back to work, or corrects an unfair price without making a moment of it. He thought about sitting on a platform in a traveler's coat with a cup of something hot and watching an hour of ordinary traffic, and having that hour mean something real. She'd come back 5 days in a row. She hadn't needed another fitting after the first one. He made himself a cup with the Kelsa root that evening. It was bitter and warm. He drank it looking at the eastern gate and then put the cup away and went asleep. He picked up the coupling and the calibration tool and finished the job the next morning. There were 2 more orders after this one, and a delivery expected from the northern gate before noon. The crossing moved around him. The loader dropped its crates in rhythm. The day kept going, and the uncomplicated way days kept going at the Vareth crossing, which was one of the things he'd always liked about it. He kept the disc near the edge of the work table, where he could see it. He didn't think of it as a reward. He thought of it as what it was: proof that someone had come all this way, in a plain coat with the hood up, looking for the thing that couldn't be faked or rehearsed or purchased, and had found it here, in a fabrication stall at the edge of Empire space, held by a man who hadn't known enough about rank to treat it as anything more than what it was. Which was, he supposed, the whole point.